Pull that chair a little closer to the stove, not because it's cold yet. It's only October, and we still have some decent weather left before the territory reminds us who is in charge. Pull it closer, because this kind of story deserves a particular arrangement. A man sitting back too far from the warmth tends to give a story less than it deserves, and this one has been waiting a long time for a proper telling. My name is Elias Crandall. I have operated this general merchandise store in Hawthorne Creek, Dakota Territory for 27 years. I have sold flour and lamp oil and fence wire and seed corn and axe handles to 3 generations of families in this valley, and I have kept a ledger of every transaction since the first week I opened, because my father told me that a man who does not keep records is a man who cannot be held accountable, and I have tried in most things to remain accountable. I keep the old ledgers on the shelf behind the counter, 27 of them now, 1 per year, bound in the same brown cloth. I can take down the 1878 volume and open it to any month and tell you exactly what this community needed to survive and exactly what it was willing to pay. Numbers do not lie, and they do not flatter, and they do not protect your feelings when your feelings need protecting. I mention the ledger because it is part of this story. Because the evidence of what I am about to tell you was sitting in that ledger in plain ink for 3 years before anyone, including me, chose to read it honestly. That is the part of this story I carry with me, not the storm, not the deaths, not the frozen rooftops or the collapsed barns. Those things are their own weight, and I carry them too. But the ledger is mine specifically, and I have not put it down. You asked me about the earth chambers on the hillsides east of town, about who built the first one and why, and what came of it. I told you I knew the woman who built it, and I told you I would tell you the whole account if you had the afternoon for it. You said you did. So, let me start where it actually starts, which is not with the building and not with the storm, but with a spring morning in 1878 and a woman who walked into this store and asked about seed corn in the most careful English I had ever heard. Each word set down like she was placing something breakable on a shelf. Her name was Ingrid Solberg. She had come over from Norway the previous year with her husband Lars, a large, quiet man who had the look of someone accustomed to working in cold. They had staked a claim about 2 miles east of town in the draw near Kettle Creek, where the land curved upward into a long, low ridge before it flattened back out into open prairie. It was not, by the standards of the Dakota Land Rush, what anyone would have called a prime claim. The truly sought-after ground was the flat ground, the broad, level stretches of black topsoil that the railroad pamphlets had promised to every tenant farmer and second son in Minnesota and Wisconsin and the whole of Scandinavia. Flat land was sensible land. Flat land you could plow from one end to the other without stopping to think. The Solberg claim had that ridge running along its northern edge. 30 feet of gradual grass-covered earth, nothing you would bother calling a hill in any serious part of the world, just a long, slow swell where the land seemed to have taken a breath it never finished releasing. The previous claimant, a man from Indiana named Elmore Pitts, had farmed below it for 2 seasons and given it up. Too awkward near the top, he said. He took the flat 40 to the south and left the ridge for someone less particular. Lars Solberg had filed on it because it was what was available and because the creek meant reliable water, and those 2 facts were sufficient for a man newly arrived and optimistic about what sufficient meant. Lars Solberg was dead by the time his wife walked into my store that spring. Typhoid, February of 1878, not 3 months after they had arrived and begun their first shanty. The frontier dispenses that kind of cruelty without ceremony, and the ceremony, when the community provides it, tends to be brief. There is too much work to be done to grieve at length, and grief at length makes the living uncomfortable in ways they do not know how to say plainly. She was 34 years old. She had 40 acres of broke prairie, a debt at the land office, a half-finished sod shanty with a failing east wall, and one brown milk cow named Britta. More than one man in town suggested to her, gently, in that particular tone that gentle suggestions take when they are not entirely voluntary, that she might consider relinquishing the claim, going back to Minnesota, where there were more of her country people, finding circumstances more suited to a woman alone. They said these things kindly. They meant them kindly. The kindness was real, and the condescension inside it was also real, and she received both with equal quiet courtesy. She thanked them, and went back to her land. What none of them knew, what she had not yet found the English to explain, and was not sure she would have explained even if she had, was that she had been looking at that ridge since the moment she first saw it, not as a problem, and not as an inconvenience, and not even as a feature of the land she had inherited by marriage and necessity. She had been looking at it the way a person looks at something familiar in an unexpected place. The way you might look at your mother's handwriting on a letter you did not know was coming. She had grown up in Telemark, in Norway, in a valley where the winters arrive like a standing army and do not leave until they have taken what they came for. Her father was a farmer, and in the long months when farming was impossible, he was a builder, not of grand things, not of anything that drew attention, but of the kind of structure that the people of that valley had been building for longer than anyone kept records of. He built cellary along the south-facing slopes of the hillsides. Earth chambers, you would call them in English, though that translation loses something in the crossing. The principle was old and had been arrived at, not through engineering theory, but through the accumulated failure of every alternative. Wood burns fast and warps and breathes the cold inward. Stone set without the earth's embrace pulls the temperature down with it, but the earth itself, properly used, excavated into, not stacked upon, does something that no constructed material can replicate. It holds. It holds at a temperature that varies only a few degrees through the entire length of a Dakota or a Norwegian winter, because it is not responding to the weather. It is responding to something older and slower than weather, the steady warmth that comes up from below, from the depth of the world, which changes by seasons measured not in months, but in decades. Her father had put her inside those chambers as a child. She knew what 50 degrees felt like when the world outside was killing things. She knew the particular quality of the silence, thick and close, the silence of mass, rather than the hollow silence of an empty room. She knew how a single tallow candle in a well-built earth chamber raises the temperature by 4 degrees, because she had watched her father measure it and record it in a notebook he kept in 2 languages, Norwegian on one side of the margin and the Latin of the old agricultural texts on the other. She had carried that notebook across the Atlantic and across half a continent along with her mother's Bible and her husband's good wool coat. It had not seemed like anything remarkable to carry. It was simply what she knew. When she looked at the ridge on the Solberg claim, the way its face turned south toward the winter sun, the way the soil on the slope was deep and dark with years of root matter, the way the creek at its base would make drainage a matter of simple geometry rather than complicated engineering, she was not seeing a problem. She was reading a sentence she already knew the words to. She began making drawings in April, cross-sections of the slope, angle calculations for drainage, dimensions for a main chamber, and, beside it, a smaller stable for Britta. She worked on these drawings at the table in the failing sod shanty. By the light of a lamp she kept turned low to save oil, using a pencil she sharpened every morning with Lars's pocket knife, because it was the only thing of his that she used without grief. She told no one in Hawthorne Creek what she was planning, not yet. She had been in this country for less than a year. She had been a widow for 3 months. She understood, with the particular clarity that comes to people who have been made vulnerable quickly and in a strange place, that an idea spoken too soon in the wrong company does not fail on its merits. It fails because the person who spoke it had not yet earned the right to be heard. She spent the spring and early summer watching the ridge and watching the community, learning both with equal patience. She started digging in June. I know the exact date because she came into my store on the 5th of June and bought a short-handled mattock on credit, and I wrote it in the ledger in the same hand I use for everything. June 5th, 1878. Solberg, I. 1 mattock, iron head, $1.40, on account. I did not ask what it was for. I extended her the credit because she had an honest face and because my wife said the woman was clearly capable of hard work, which my wife considered the primary qualification for creditworthiness. By the end of June, the people of Hawthorne Creek were riding out on Sunday afternoons to watch. What they saw was a Norwegian widow in a worn work dress, digging into the face of a low hillside with a mattock and a spade and a wheelbarrow that needed its wheel adjusted every hour or so. She worked in the mornings and the late afternoons, resting through the heat of midday. She talked to Britta the cow in Norwegian while she worked, which the neighboring children found remarkable enough to report to their parents in detail. By mid-July, she had excavated a main chamber approximately 12 feet wide and heading deeper by the week. Next to it, angled slightly for reasons nobody standing outside could immediately identify, a second, smaller opening had appeared, the beginnings of what she intended as a stable. The commentary that attached itself to this project was not, I want to be clear about this, the product of malicious people. Hawthorne Creek was not a malicious community. It was a community of working people with an established understanding of what a sensible person did and a corresponding discomfort with visible departures from that understanding. The discomfort expressed itself as humor because humor is the least costly form of social correction, and a community with limited resources tends toward economy in all things, including correction. The Pearson boys, twins, 10 years old, the sort of children who are always slightly ahead of adult conversation because they are listening to all of it, began calling the excavation the Norwegian Hole. The name was adopted within a week by the older boys, and within a month by their fathers, who used it with the particular tone that men use when they have decided something is too strange to take seriously but too persistent to ignore. Thomas Halverson, whose claim adjoined Peter Larson's to the north, said at the feed store one afternoon that he didn't know a thing about Norwegian customs, but where he came from, a hole in the ground, was where you put things you wanted to keep cold, not where you put yourself. The men around him appreciated this observation. Pastor Anders Bergman rode out in late August on his gray mare with the careful dignity of a man who has decided to discharge an uncomfortable obligation before it grows heavier. He was a decent man, and I want that to be part of the record too. He was not performing authority or enjoying the occasion. He sat on his horse and looked at the entrance, taking shape in the hillside, at the timber frame Ingrid had begun mortising into the opening, at the careful drainage trench she had laid along the base of the berm, and he shook his head in the slow way that people shake their heads when they are genuinely puzzled rather than merely dismissive. He told her that he understood the impulse toward economy. He told her that the Lord knew this land demanded it from all of them. But there were obligations, he said, that went beyond economy. There was the question of what it meant, in the eyes of God and of the community, to put people underground. He chose his words carefully, because he was a careful man. He said that a dwelling beneath the earth carried a particular theological weight that a dwelling above it did not, and that he could not in good conscience watch a member of his congregation take up residence in a place that the Scriptures reserved for the dead and for those awaiting judgment. Ingrid listened to him with complete attention. She offered him coffee from the small camp stove she kept near the entrance, and he accepted because declining coffee is also a theological act of sorts, and he had not intended to go that far. While he drank it, she showed him her father's notebook. She showed him the temperature records kept over 20 winters in the Telemark Valley. She showed him her own measurements, taken from the shallow test pit she had dug in April and monitored for 6 weeks before committing to the full design. Outside temperatures swinging 15 degrees in a single day. The temperature in the pit moving less than 2 degrees across an entire week. The pastor looked at the notebook. He looked at the numbers. He was, as I have said, a decent man, and decent men tend to give evidence more than a glance, even when it conflicts with their prior positions. "Very ingenious," he said at last, in the tone of a man granting a point without conceding the argument. "But this is not telemark, Mrs. Solberg." She looked at him steadily. "No," she said, "it is colder." He rode back to town and told his wife that the Solberg woman was the most stubborn person he had encountered in 20 years of ministry, and that he was genuinely uncertain whether her stubbornness was going to serve her well or destroy her, and that he found the uncertainty troubling in a way he couldn't quite set down. His wife, Hilda, asked him to describe exactly what the interior of the test pit had felt like when he stood near it. He thought about it for a moment. "Cool," he said. "Remarkably cool, like a cellar." Hilda said nothing, but she filed the information in the particular place where she kept things she intended to think about further, and she thought about it for the rest of that summer, and into the fall, and through the first winter, while her husband's certainty held its shape, and her own began quietly and without announcement to develop a question at its center. That question would take 2 more winters to find its answer. And the answer, when it came in the form of weather. There is a question that people ask when they hear this story, and they ask it in different ways depending on what kind of person they are. The practical-minded ones ask, how did she know it would work? The more philosophical ones ask, how did she know to try it at all? These sound like the same question. They are not. The first is a question about confidence. The second is a question about origin, about where an idea comes from and what carries it across distance, and whether knowledge that travels in a person is the same knowledge by the time it arrives as it was when it departed. I have thought about this for 27 years, off and on, in the manner of a man who does not have the formal education to answer it properly, but has had sufficient time behind a store counter to observe the evidence. And what I have come to believe is this. The idea did not begin with Ingrid Solberg. It began with her father, in a valley in Norway, who learned it from men older than himself, who learned it from men older still. It began, if you want to follow it all the way back, with the first person who was cold enough and intelligent enough and desperate enough to understand that the earth is not the enemy of warmth, but its oldest and most reliable keeper. Ingrid inherited that understanding the way you inherit a language, not by studying it, but by living inside it until it becomes the medium through which you perceive everything else. What she did here in Dakota was translate. Her father's name was Torsten Aslaksen. He had worked the same 40 acres in the Telemark Valley for 31 years and built 6 earth chambers in that time, each one an improvement on the last, each one incorporating what the previous one had taught him about the specific behavior of the specific soil on the specific slope he was working with. He kept records. This was not common among Norwegian farmers of his generation, and it was the thing about him that Ingrid, as a child, had found most remarkable, not the building itself, which she grew up taking for granted, but the systematic observation that preceded and followed every decision. He would not begin work on a chamber until he had dug a test pit and monitored it through at least 2 weeks of varying weather. He would not cover the ceiling until he had measured the humidity of the interior walls at the back, the middle, and the front, because he understood that a chamber that is warm but wet is worse than no chamber at all. He would not call a structure finished until it had survived 1 full winter, and he had walked through it the following March with his hand flat against the walls, checking for moisture. He taught Ingrid to do these things not as lessons, but as habits, the way you teach a child to check the sky before leaving the house, or to feel a horse's legs before saddling it. By the time she was 16, she could read a hillside the way he could look at the vegetation on a slope and estimate the clay content of the soil beneath it, could stand at the base of a south-facing rise and calculate, roughly, the solar gain across a winter's day. She did not know the formal names for what she was doing. She did not need them. The knowledge was older than its names. She brought his notebook with her to America. It was a small book, perhaps 80 pages, covered in the slightly irregular handwriting of a man who had taught himself to write later in life than his ideal. The entries mixed Norwegian with fragments of Latin he had found in an old agricultural text, and occasionally with a language Ingrid could not identify, possibly an older form of Norwegian, she thought, or possibly something else entirely, some technical vocabulary that had been handed down alongside the methods themselves and had become inseparable from them. She could read most of it. The parts she could not read she had memorized as a child, hearing him recite them while he worked, and she carried them in the same way she carried his methods, not as ideas she had chosen, but as things that were simply part of her. I said earlier that she had been watching the community as well as the ridge that spring. I want to explain what I mean by that, because it matters to what she decided to do and what she decided not to do. She understood with a precision that her English was not yet adequate to express that the people of Hawthorne Creek had a theory of the world, not an unusual thing. Every community has one, and frontier communities tend to hold theirs with particular force, because the effort of building a life in a difficult place requires a certain immunity to doubt. You cannot second-guess your methods every morning when your methods are the only thing between your family and a genuinely hostile landscape. You build your certainty the same way you build your house, quickly from what is available, and then you do not question the foundation, because questioning the foundation is a luxury that people with enough time and safety can afford, and you are not yet those people. Their theory of the world included specific provisions about shelter. Timber frame construction was the correct way to build a house. This was not merely a preference. It was an article of faith supported by what they considered overwhelming evidence. The sawmills existed, the lumber was available, men with families and the means to do so had built timber frame houses, and those houses were standing, and the settlement was therefore proof of the theory's validity. An earth chamber on a hillside was not a variation on this theory, it was a challenge to it, and a challenge issued by a foreign widow with insufficient English and a dead husband and a cow was not, in the accounting of 1878, the kind of challenge a community felt obliged to take seriously. Ingrid saw this clearly. She made a decision that I have come to believe was both right and costly. She would not argue. She would demonstrate. And the demonstration would require time, and the time would require patience, and the patience would require her to absorb the community's skepticism without responding to it in any way that would give them reason to dismiss her further. It was a form of discipline I am not sure I could have maintained. I know I did not maintain the inverse of it, the discipline to speak up when speaking up was warranted. And my failure in that respect is one of the things I keep returning to when I am honest with myself in the evenings. But that is my accounting, not hers. Hers was construction. Let me tell you about the construction. The test pit came first. In the last week of April 1878, before she bought the mattock, before she told anyone what she intended, she dug a hole in the south face of the ridge approximately 4 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and 4 feet tall, just large enough to crouch inside with a thermometer and a notebook. She covered the opening with a square of canvas weighted at the edges with creek stones. Every morning for 6 weeks, at sunrise, she recorded 2 temperatures, the outside air temperature, taken from a thermometer hung on the north post of Britta's temporary shelter, and the interior temperature of the pit, taken by crouching inside it with the canvas sealed behind her. The outside temperatures across those 6 weeks swung from 34 degrees on a cold night to 78 degrees on a warm afternoon, a range of 44 degrees. The temperature inside the pit moved from 51 degrees to 54 degrees across the same period, a range of 3 degrees. She recorded this in her notebook with a steadiness that, reading it later, I found almost unsettling. No exclamation, no expression of vindication, just the numbers, and below them, in the careful English she was practicing, consistent, proceed. She committed to the full design on the first day of June. She spent the next 4 days at the table in the sod shanty redrawing her father's cross-section diagrams in the context of this specific hillside, The drainage angle adjusted for the slope of the creek bank. The ventilation flue recalculated to follow a natural depression in the ridge rather than cutting directly upward. The entrance tunnel lengthened to 22 feet because she had determined that this particular soil retained cold air in pockets near the surface, and she needed a longer buffer zone than her father's Norwegian hillsides had required. She drew the entrance tunnel with a deliberate bend in it at the 14-foot mark. Not a sharp angle, just enough of a deflection to break the line of sight and, more importantly, to interrupt the movement of cold air. Cold air is heavy. It moves in straight lines if it can, and pools when it cannot. The bend in the tunnel would prevent the main chamber from being accessed directly by the cold mass that accumulated in the outer section of the entry. She had seen her father use the same device. She had once asked him why it mattered if cold air couldn't see around a corner, and he had laughed and said that cold air couldn't think around a corner either, and that the practical result was the same. She bought the mattock on June 5th. She began digging on June 7th. The work proceeded in a rhythm that was, from the outside, entirely unremarkable and entirely relentless. She rose before light. She drank coffee and gave Britta her morning ration. She dug from first light until the heat of midday made the work dangerous rather than merely difficult, rested through the afternoon with her father's notebook and her own drawings, and dug again from late afternoon until the light failed. She cooked a simple meal after dark. She slept. She kept her own notebook alongside her father's now, recording daily progress in the same factual style he had used. July 3rd. Advanced main chamber by 18 inches. Total depth now 11 feet. Striking denser clay layer at back wall. Good. Resistance to the pick increasing, which means moisture retention will decrease. This is correct. And the following day, July 4th, slower progress. Clay is dense. Good news and slow news together. The walls of the main chamber she did not leave rough. This was the detail that puzzled the people who rode out on Sundays to observe, because it appeared to be the detail least connected to any practical purpose. They could understand digging, more or less. They could understand the timber framing of the entrance, which resembled in its basic logic the framing of a mine shaft. What they could not understand was why she spent 4 months, smoothing the interior walls with a flat creek stone, working in slow, overlapping circles, moving from the back wall forward, from floor to ceiling, methodical and patient, and apparently impervious to how it looked from outside. The reason was moisture. A rough wall in packed earth creates thousands of small concave surfaces, and each concave surface collects water. Water in an earth chamber is not a comfort problem. It is a structural problem, and then a health problem, and then a failure of the entire premise. Her father had taught her, the enemy of warmth is not cold. The enemy of warmth is wet. A smooth wall sheds water. A smooth wall stays dry. A smooth wall is the difference between a chamber that works for 30 years and one that develops rot in the framing and seepage in the floor by the third winter. She smoothed the walls. It took as long as it took. In August came the work that no one watched, and that I have come to believe was the most important work of the entire construction. The ceiling of the main chamber was packed earth approximately 6 feet deep from the chamber ceiling to the surface of the hillside above it. 6 feet of earth is not, in itself, reliable protection against water. Rain falls on the surface. Snowmelt in spring flows down slope. A chamber ceiling that is simply capped with bare soil will, over time, absorb moisture from above and transmit it downward, and the smoothed walls and the drainage floor and all the rest of the engineering will be working against an adversary that enters from the top rather than the sides. Ingrid had watched the prairie for a full year by August of 1878, and one of the things she had watched most carefully was the behavior of water on slopes. Specifically, she had watched where the grass grew thickest and where it grew thin. Thin grass on a slope means the soil beneath drains quickly, useful for the diversion trenches she was planning, but not useful for a roof. Thick grass on a slope, The kind that forms a mat rather than individual plants means the roots have interlocked horizontally and vertically over years into a structure that holds water, slows it, and releases it gradually rather than transmitting it in a rush. She wanted that mat on top of her chamber. Over 3 weeks in August, she cut sod from the sections of the prairie where the grass grew thickest, heavy, root-dense squares that required a sharp spade and both hands to lift, and stacked them in overlapping layers across the berm and the chamber ceiling, grass side up, each layer offset from the one below it the way a mason offsets courses of brick. She packed the seams with loose soil from the excavation. She soaked the whole surface with creek water and tamped it down with a flat board. By September, the sod had knitted. By October, you could not easily distinguish the chamber ceiling from the surrounding hillside unless you knew where to look. The grass grew. The roots went deeper. The mat thickened. Rain that fell on the chamber roof did not pool and did not penetrate. It was absorbed by the living root system above, transpired back into the air by the grass, or moved laterally through the mat toward the edges of the berm where it could drain harmlessly away. She had not built a roof. She had recruited the prairie to become one. I did not understand this until she explained it to me years later in the matter-of-fact way she explained most things, as though the logic were obvious, and the only difficulty had been execution. She said her father had used the same method in Telemark, and that the oldest chambers in the valley, the ones that had been standing for more than 100 years when she was a child, all had living roofs that had been laid in this manner and had not been touched since. The grass does the work, she said. You just have to ask it correctly. I wrote that down in my own notebook when I got home that evening, in the space after the day's accounts. I wrote it the way you write something you do not want to lose. I have looked at it many times since. I believe it is the clearest description of her general method that she ever gave, not just of the roof, not just of the construction, but of everything she understood about building in a landscape that most of her neighbors were still treating as an adversary to be overcome rather than a logic to be read. You have to ask it correctly. The prairie does not resist a person who speaks its language. It did not resist her. She had been learning its language since the previous spring, and by the time the first frost came in October of 1878, the hillside had absorbed her work into itself so completely that a man riding past at a distance might have looked at that low ridge and seen nothing but grass and sky and the ordinary face of the Dakota landscape. He would have been looking directly at a home. He would not have known what he was seeing. That, I have come to understand, was precisely the point. There is a particular kind of knowledge that cannot be acquired any other way than by being wrong in the specific place and at the specific time that the wrongness matters most. Book knowledge is not this. Book knowledge is borrowed wrongness, the recorded failures of other people transmitted forward in time so that those who come after do not have to repeat every mistake from the beginning. This is valuable. I do not diminish it. But there is a category of error that books cannot fully transmit, because the error is not in the reasoning but in the application, and the application depends on conditions so specific, this hillside, this soil, this angle of drainage, this depth of frost, that no book written for general audiences can account for all of them. You have to be there. You have to make the mistake in the actual place, with the actual material, in the actual season. And then you have to be the kind of person who records it honestly and adjusts without self-pity and goes back to work. Ingrid Solberg was that kind of person. Her father had made her that kind of person, and the frontier had confirmed it. The first year of construction was not a smooth progression from design to completion. It was a series of lessons, some of them expensive, some of them merely time-consuming, all of them necessary. I know this because she told me about them years later, with the calm specificity of a person who has fully digested a difficulty and no longer needs to protect herself from its memory. She did not tell these stories as complaints. She told them as data. I will tell them to you the same way she told them to me. The first serious problem arrived in March of 1879. The construction had proceeded through the fall and early winter of 1878 with no major interruption. By November, the main chamber was fully excavated, and the walls were smoothed, and the sod roof had knitted itself into the hillside, and the entrance tunnel was framed, and the small cast-iron stove was fitted, and the flue was drawing properly. She had tested it with a handful of green grass, watching the smoke curl upward and inward, and then straighten and move steadily toward the flue opening, which told her the draw was correct and consistent. She moved in on the 14th of October, as I told you. The first winter was not catastrophic. She was warm. She used less wood than anyone in the settlement, which I could see from my ledger and which she could see from her woodpile, and she recorded the comparison without comment in her notebook. But March arrived, and with it the particular difficulty that Dakota Territory reserves for anyone who has built anything close to a hillside and has not accounted for what happens when 6 months of accumulated snow begins, slowly, and then rapidly, and then all at once, to move. The snowmelt came from above and from the sides. It came from the prairie at the crest of the ridge, where the snow had compacted into a dense layer over the winter, and it came from the slopes to the east and west, where drifts had built against the ridge face. It came in volumes that the drainage trench she had laid along the base of the berm in the fall, a good trench, correctly angled, she had done it right, could not accommodate alone. The trench filled and then exceeded its capacity, and the excess water found the path of least resistance, which was, as water's paths of least resistance tend to be, the exact place she had not fully anticipated, the junction between the berm and the entrance tunnel frame. She woke on the morning of March 9th to find a thin sheet of water moving across the floor of the entrance tunnel, coming from the left side of the outer door frame where the timber met the earth, and the earth had softened enough in the thaw to admit the intrusion. She stood in the tunnel and looked at it for a moment. Then she went back inside, put on her work coat, and went outside to look at the hillside. The problem was not the trench. The trench was working correctly for what it had been designed to handle. The problem was that the snowmelt coming off the upper ridge was traveling subsurface through the soil, moving not as visible runoff, but as a slow percolation through the root layer, invisible from above, undetectable until it reached the impermeable barrier of the berm wall, and had nowhere left to go but along the wall's base toward the structure. She stood in the March cold and looked at the hillside for a long time. Then she went back to her father's notebook. He had written about this, not in a chapter of its own. It was folded into an entry about a specific chamber he had rebuilt in his 3rd year of construction, one that had developed exactly this problem. His solution had been a secondary interception trench set further up the slope, not at the base of the berm but 15 feet above it, cut across the hillside at an angle that directed subsurface water laterally, away from the structure entirely, before it reached the berm wall. He called it a foregruft, a foreditch, a preventative rather than a remedial measure. He had drawn it in his careful, slightly irregular hand, with the angle marked and the depth specified, and a note beside it that read, in the old mixed language, "This is the trench you dig before the problem. The trench after the problem costs 3 times as much and teaches you the same lesson." Ingrid dug the foreditch in March of 1879 in conditions that I would not wish on any person I respected. The ground was in that particular intermediate state that the Dakota spring produces, frozen below, saturated above, with a surface that gives under a spade but refreezes overnight so that every morning you are breaking through a new crust of ice before you reach the softened soil beneath. She worked for 3 weeks. The foreditch ran 23 feet across the face of the ridge, 15 feet above the berm, angled at 7 degrees from the horizontal toward the east, where the creek provided a natural terminus. She packed its uphill wall with the dense clay she had excavated from the main chamber the previous summer, clay she had kept in a pile near the entrance specifically because her father's notebook had told her to keep excavated clay rather than disposing of it, that it would be needed for ceiling work later. She lined the base of the trench with flat creek stones to prevent the clay bottom from softening in the next spring's melt. When she was finished, the fore-ditch was invisible from the valley floor. It interrupted nothing visible. It produced no structure, no feature, nothing a Sunday observer would have ridden out to watch. The following March, the snowmelt moved as before, subsurface, through the root layer, down the slope toward the berm. It reached the fore-ditch. It turned east. It followed the angled channel to the creek, moving quietly and invisibly and harmlessly away from the structure, exactly as her father's notebook had predicted. She made a single entry that March. Fore-ditch held. No intrusion at Frame Junction. Father was right, as usual. This is the trench you dig before the problem. The second lesson came not from water, but from weight. In the winter of 1879, a heavier snowfall than she had accounted for in her ceiling calculations settled on the sod roof. Not catastrophically, the chamber did not fail. Nothing collapsed. The roof performed as designed. But in the spring, when she walked the surface of the berm and pressed her boot into the soil, she found two places where the sod had separated from the layer below it, leaving a gap of perhaps an inch between the living root mat and the packed earth beneath. She understood immediately what had caused it. The snow load had compressed the living layer downward while the frozen earth below it had expanded laterally, a differential movement, the two materials responding to temperature change at different rates. The gap was not structural. It would close when the earth warmed and the frost released its lateral pressure. But it was a warning about what a severe enough load might do over time, and she took warning seriously. Her solution was additional thickness. Over the summer of 1879, she added a second layer of sod to the entire ceiling surface, a process identical to the first laying, cutting root-dense squares from the thicker prairie sections, staggering the seams, tamping, and soaking. The added weight of the second layer increased the compression on the layers below it, which improved the bonding rather than stressing it. Two bound layers, she had observed, did not behave as two separate layers under load. They behaved as one thicker layer, and one thick layer is geometrically more resistant to differential movement than two thin ones. This is the kind of thing that does not announce itself. When a roof does not fail, nobody remarks upon it. But I want you to understand that the roof she was building was not a lucky structure. It was a reasoned one, and the reasoning was being continuously tested and continuously refined through small failures that she caught early and addressed thoroughly. And the thoroughness was not perfectionism. It was the professional habit of a person who understood that small failures not addressed become large failures that cannot be. By the fall of 1879, the dwelling was what she had designed it to be. I had been inside it by then. She had invited me out in August, after Hilda Bergman's visit the previous May had made its quiet way through the community's conversation and produced, if not a change of opinion, at least a reduction in the certainty with which the old opinion was held. I went on a Tuesday afternoon in August, when the outside temperature was touching 93 degrees. I will not spend many words on what I experienced, because she described it better than I can in the single sentence I quoted to you before. The earth does not argue with weather. It simply does not participate. The temperature inside the main chamber on a 93-degree August afternoon was 57 degrees. I stood in the center of the room and put my hand flat against the smoothed wall, and it was cool and dry, the dryness being in some ways more remarkable than the temperature, because every wooden structure in the territory was humid in August from the combination of heat and the residual moisture that timber never fully releases. I looked at the carved shelf niches, the bed platform built from cottonwood planks, the small table and two chairs, the stove with its angled flue, the oil lamp mounted on a bracket she had chiseled directly into the stone-lined wall. I looked at the ventilation opening at floor level, a 4-inch gap fitted with a removable wooden plug, and the corresponding exhaust opening near the ceiling where the flue began its angled climb through the hill. I looked at the entrance to the stable where Britta could be heard shifting her weight with the particular contentment of an animal that is not hot. I looked at all of it and I thought, she has done it. And then I went back to my store and wrote nothing in the ledger that day except the routine entries, and said nothing to the men who came in that afternoon except the routine pleasantries. And I have thought about that silence every time I have opened the 1879 volume since. The autumn of 1880 arrived differently. I know this is the part you have been waiting for, and I want to approach it the way it deserves to be approached, not as the dramatic turn, not as the moment the story has been building toward, but as what it actually was. The natural consequence of a sequence that had been in motion for years, arriving on schedule, visible in advance to anyone who had been paying attention to the correct things. Ingrid Solberg had been paying attention to the correct things. The signs began in August. She noted them in her notebook without alarm, but with the specific deliberateness of a person who is filing observations that will matter later. The field mice that usually moved into the ridge's root structure in October began moving in late August, 6 weeks early. She could hear them in the evenings, their small, industrious sounds in the sod ceiling above the main chamber, and she recognized the sound not as a nuisance, but as information. The meadowlarks, which normally held their territory on the ridge face through most of September, were gone by the first week of August, not reduced in number. Gone. As though they had received a communication, she had not. The creek dropped 3 inches below its late summer average by mid-September, which was notable because September had not been dry. They had received adequate rain through July and August. A creek that drops in a wet September is losing its upstream feed, which means the high country to the northwest is either dry or frozen. In September. The high country freezing in September meant the cold was coming from further north and earlier than any winter she had observed in her 2 years in the territory. The wild plum and buffalo berry on the ridge face produced in late September a fruit crop so heavy that the branches of the oldest plants bent to within a foot of the ground. She stood among them one morning and looked at this and thought about what it meant when a plant fruits beyond its normal capacity, whether it was abundance or urgency, whether the distinction mattered. She decided it did not matter which it was. Either reading pointed in the same direction. She visited Hilda Bergman on the 2nd of October. She brought her notebook and her barometer readings and the record of the creek levels and the notes she had made about the wildlife departures. She sat at Hilda's kitchen table and laid these things out with the same methodical clarity she brought to everything, and she explained what she believed they indicated. She did not claim certainty. She said, "This is what I have observed, and this is what the same observations would have meant in Telemark, and I believe they mean something similar here." Hilda listened. Hilda understood more than most people gave her credit for understanding. She sat across the table and looked at the notebook pages and the barometer chart, and she did not dismiss any of it. She asked 2 precise questions about the creek levels, the kind of questions that told Ingrid she was not being merely polite, but was genuinely engaging with the evidence. When Ingrid finished, Hilda said, "I will speak to Anders." Ingrid looked at her for a moment. Then she closed her notebook and thanked her and put on her coat and walked the 2 miles back to the ridge. She did not hear from Hilda for 3 days, then a week. She did not return to ask. She understood, in the way that people understand things they have no power to change, what had happened in the space between Hilda's private conviction and whatever conversation had or had not occurred with the pastor, and between the pastor's response and whatever public form that response had or had not taken. She understood the distance between a good woman's belief and a good woman's voice, and she did not blame Hilda for it, because she knew that distance is one of the longest in human experience and is not closed by will alone. She went home and began her final preparations. She ordered from my store on the 10th of October. 50 pounds of dried beans, 40 pounds of cornmeal, 30 pounds of salt pork, 2 extra lamp wicks, and 4 additional cords of wood beyond her usual winter supply. I remember the order clearly. It was the largest single purchase she had ever made on her account. I asked her, as I wrote it in the ledger, whether she was expecting company. She looked at me with those gray eyes that always seemed to be measuring something just past the thing they were aimed at. "I am expecting a long winter, Mr. Crandall," she said. I told her it couldn't be worse than last year. I was trying to be reassuring. She received the reassurance with the same patient courtesy she received everything she did not agree with. "I hope you are right," she said. She paid what she could on the account and noted the remainder in the small book she kept in her coat pocket, and she left. I watched her walk east on the road toward the ridge, growing smaller against the October sky, and I went back to my counter. I did not increase my own winter supplies that week. I did not mention her order to anyone. I did not take down the 1878 ledger and show anyone the firewood numbers, which I had been looking at privately for 2 years, and which told a very plain story to anyone willing to read it. I told myself it was not my business to alarm people based on one woman's intuition. But it was not intuition I had been watching for 2 years. It was evidence. There is a difference between those two things, and I knew it then, and the knowing was precisely why I put the ledger back on the shelf and said nothing, and went on selling lamp oil and fence wire to people who were about to discover that the world they had built their certainty inside of was not the world that was coming toward them. On the 17th of October, the sky above Hawthorne Creek turned the color of old pewter before noon. By supper, the wind had a smell to it that I had not encountered before, something metallic and flat, with a coldness that registered not as temperature, but as intention. By morning, the winter of the blue snow had arrived. I have described 3 winters to you this afternoon. The first was the winter of proof, quiet, statistical, legible only in a ledger that nobody asked to see. The second was the winter of confirmation, harder, more telling, still absorbed by a community that had made up its mind and was not prepared to unmake it on the basis of a Norwegian widow's firewood consumption. The third was the winter that removed all remaining options. I want to describe it to you the way it actually was, which is to say, without the dramatic architecture that memory tends to impose on events after enough years have passed to make them feel like a story rather than a sequence of days that people were simply trying to survive. It was not one catastrophe, it was accumulation. It was the particular cruelty of a siege rather than an assault, not a single blow that you absorb and recover from, but a sustained, methodical pressure applied without pause or mercy across 9 weeks until every structure and every reserve and every margin of safety that the settlement had constructed against the cold had been found and exhausted and found wanting. The first week, people managed. The storms came in succession. 2 days of blizzard, a brief clearing, another 3 days of blizzard, a day of deceptive stillness, and then more. The temperature between storms did not recover to anything a person could call reasonable. It settled at 15 below and held there, so that the clearing days were not relief, but merely a pause in the active assault, the cold doing its work more quietly without the wind, but doing it just as thoroughly. The frame houses of Hawthorne Creek were not poor structures. I want to be clear about that because it matters to the account. Peter Larson had spent 3 years improving his house, good chinking, double-shuttered windows, a stone foundation that the frost could not heave. The Bergman's house was the sturdiest in the settlement, built with lumber hauled from 2 counties away. The Halverson brothers had constructed their shared barn from green timber the previous summer, and it had dried true through the fall. These were the efforts of capable people working with the best methods available to them. Those methods failed. Not because the people were careless, because the methods had been designed for ordinary winters, and the winter of the blue snow was not an ordinary winter. It was the winter that showed what ordinary meant. The chinking contracted in the sustained cold and opened gaps that had not existed in November. The window shutters, however carefully fitted, admitted drafts that a man could feel from 6 feet away. The snow load on the roofs built not in episodes, but continuously, each storm adding to what the previous had left, and the green timber of the Halverson barn groaned under it from January onward with the slow, steady complaint of material being asked to do more than it was made to do. The firewood went first, not all at once. One household at a time through February, the wood supplies that had looked sufficient in October revealed themselves as calibrated for a different winter than the one in progress. The Pearson family was the first. Ernst Pearson had laid in what he considered a generous supply. 7 cords, more than he had used in either of the previous 2 winters. He was burning through a cord every 5 days in February. The arithmetic was not complicated, and it was not encouraging, and the morning he split the last piece and looked at the empty woodpile and looked at the sky and looked at his children, something in his accounting of the situation changed permanently. Clara Pearson made the decision that her husband could not yet make. She had been watching the faint thread of smoke from Ingrid's flue pipe on the ridge for 2 weeks, the only chimney smoke in the valley that rose consistently, that was not interrupted by the storms that appeared every morning without fail, as thin and steady as a needle, drawing a line through the gray sky. She had been watching it the way a person watches a lighthouse from a distance, not yet in the water, but aware that the water is close. She bundled her boys in everything they owned. She put the baby inside her coat against her body. She told Ernst they were going to Mrs. Solberg's. He started to say something, and she looked at him, and he put on his coat and went first to break the trail. The walk was a 1/4 mile. It took them 40 minutes. When they reached the entrance, the outer door was barely visible above the drift line. Ernst dug it free with his hands. He knocked. The door opened within a minute. I have heard Clara describe that moment many times over the years, at quilting circles and at church socials and at the table in the back of my store, where women sometimes sat and talked while their husbands attended to things outside. She always described it the same way, with the same pause before the central fact, as though even decades later, the physics of it required a moment of preparation. She said, "We walked through that door and I felt it before I understood it. The cold stopped. Not gradually, it stopped. 3 steps inside that tunnel and it stopped. 38 degrees below zero outside, 51 degrees inside the main chamber. The transition across the length of the entrance tunnel, the thermal lock Ingrid had built precisely for this purpose, the long buffer she had calculated and her father had designed, and the people of Hawthorne Creek had spent 2 years considering pointlessly complicated," Clara cried. She was not, as she was always careful to note when she told the story, a woman given to crying. She cried because the warmth was physical and immediate, and because her baby, inside her coat, made a small sound that was not distress, and because the Pearson twins stood in the center of the chamber with their mouths open and their frost-burned faces beginning to flush with returned color, and because Ingrid already had soup on the small stove. Ingrid did not say, "I told you." She did not say, "I tried to warn you." She did not compose her face into any expression that required the Pearsons to register her restraint. She handed Ernst a blanket. She lifted the baby from Clara's coat and held her for a moment near the stove. She ladled soup. That was all. That was everything. The others came as the days continued. Old Marcus Webb arrived 2 days before the Pearsons, a bachelor homesteader who had never asked anyone for anything in 20 years on the territory, who appeared at the entrance tunnel at 7 in the morning with his hat in his hands and his face so thoroughly frost-burned that Ingrid took one look at him and had him inside and seated before he had finished the first sentence of whatever he had prepared to say. She did not make him say it. The Knutson family. The Halverson brothers, who arrived together the morning after their barn roof gave way, walking side by side through the drift in a silence that communicated everything about what the previous night had cost them in pride and property, both. Hilda Bergman arrived not in any extremity, not in crisis, not driven to the door by the failure of her house or her woodpile. She arrived by decision. She looked at her husband one evening in late January and said that Ingrid Solberg's dwelling was warmer than their house. She knew this. She had stood inside it herself in August of the previous year. She had felt it, and that she intended to go there, and that she wanted him to come with her. Pastor Bergman looked at his wife for a long moment. Then he put on his coat. By the first week of February, 19 people and 3 cows occupied the chamber and stable that Ingrid had built for 1 person and 1 cow. The temperature in the main chamber across those 9 weeks never dropped below 47 degrees. She burned 1 log in the morning and 1 in the evening. 19 people. 9 weeks. 47 degrees minimum on nights when the outside temperature erased the possibility of survival for anyone not sheltered by mass and design. The hill held. It held exactly as she had said it would hold. And it held without drama, without any particular effort or heroism or moment of narrow escape. It held the way a well-made thing holds, which is to say, quietly, consistently, and without requiring anyone's admiration. Peter Larson arrived last. He came alone at 2 in the morning on the 12th of February, and he stood in the entrance after Ingrid opened the door and he said her name, and then he said, "I have been a proud and foolish man, and I am sorry for it." She looked at him in the lamplight for a moment. Then she said, "Peter, what stopped you from asking sooner? I would like to understand." He thought about it. Not the quick deflection of a man who has prepared an answer, but the genuine pause of a man confronting a question he has not yet honestly put to himself. He said finally, "I think I could not afford to believe you were right, because if you were right, it meant I had been wrong in a way that was not a small wrong." She considered this. "Yes," she said, "I know that cost. Come inside." He came in. He found a place on the floor near the stove. Later, when the chamber was quiet and most of the 19 people were sleeping in the particular deep way of people whose bodies have been operating under sustained stress and have finally been permitted to release it, he asked her how it worked. Not as a gesture of courtesy, as the first question of a student who has finally found his way to the right classroom. She sat across from him, and she began to explain. The winter released its hold in the middle of April. The survivors emerged into a landscape that required several minutes of standing still before it could be fully absorbed. The open prairie had been reorganized by the snow into forms that bore no relationship to the geography of October. Hollows that had been creeks were now white plains. Fences existed as suggestions rather than structures. The Halverson barn was a geometry of collapsed timber that would take the better part of a summer to clear. 14 people in the wider district had died. 8 of the 80 structures in the Hawthorne Creek settlement were damaged beyond practical repair. The community that came through the winter was not the community that had entered it. Something had been removed that does not grow back quickly in a place. The particular confidence of people who have not yet been fully shown what they are living inside of. The conversations that followed happened slowly, in the way real conversations happen, not in a single meeting with a prepared agenda, but in accumulations of exchange at my counter and at each other's kitchen tables across the weeks of April and May. They always arrived at the same place. Peter Larson arrived there first and most plainly, standing at my counter one morning in April with the direct manner of a man who has decided to stop negotiating with himself. "We need to build more of them," he said. She said she would explain it. "I am going to ask her." He did ask her. They all asked her. She taught them through the summer of 1881 with the same methodical patience she had used to build, showing them how to read a hillside, how to test soil, how to calculate drainage, how to lay sod, how to smooth a wall, how to design a flue that drew slowly enough to be efficient. She taught them the foreditch. She taught them why the entrance tunnel bent. She taught Clara Pearson the moisture principle, and Clara put it into the form she would pass to her daughters. The enemy of warmth is not cold. The enemy of warmth is wet. By the fall of 1881, 4 new earth structures were under construction in the valley. By the winter of 1886, 11 families in Hawthorne Creek and the 2 adjacent valleys lived in homes that traced their design directly back to a notebook kept in 2 languages by a farmer in Telemark who had never heard of Dakota Territory. The term the Norwegian hole persisted in the settlement's vocabulary, as terms do. But it changed, the way language always changes when the thing it describes turns out to be something other than what the namers intended. By 1890, when a man in Hawthorne Creek called a structure a Norwegian hole, he meant it was built to last. He meant it was built for the world as it actually is. Ingrid Solberg lived in her dwelling for 31 years. She died in it on the 14th of January, 1909, in her sleep, at 64 years old. Hilda Bergman was with her at the end. The 2 women had been close for 28 years by then, a friendship that had begun in August of 1879 when Hilda stood in a 57-degree chamber on a 91-degree afternoon and understood something she had not been able to say aloud for 2 more years after that. When it was over, Hilda checked the thermometer on the interior wall, as Ingrid would have done. As Ingrid had always done, first thing each morning, the habit of a builder who never stopped observing the evidence. It read 52 degrees. Outside on that January morning, the temperature was 41 below zero. They buried her on the crest of the ridge, above the entrance to her dwelling, where the winter sun finds the south face of the hill on even the coldest days, and rests there for a while before moving on. The marker is a flat piece of local limestone, painted in 2 languages, Norwegian first. The words are her father's from the old notebook, a line he wrote in the margin beside a temperature record from a winter in Telemark when the cold was severe and the chambers held and the families inside them were safe. She listened to the earth. The earth answered. I have kept you a long time, and the light is going, and you have a good many notes in that book of yours. Before you go, take down the 1878 ledger from that shelf, the brown cloth one, 3rd from the left. Open it to June. Find the entry for the 5th. Solberg, 1 Matic iron head, $1.40 on account. That is where it begins in my records, 1 Matic, $1.40. A woman I extended credit to because my wife said she had the look of someone who would do the work. My wife was right. My wife was right about most things. I should have listened to her more carefully about which things mattered and which ones I was using as reasons to stay quiet. The hill is still there, 2 miles east on the road out of town. You can see the entrance from the road if you know where to look, the timber frame she mortised herself, and above it, the grass of the sod roof, indistinguishable from the surrounding hillside, except for the small iron flue pipe rising from the crown. And in winter, the thin thread of smoke from the current occupant's morning fire going straight up in still air, the way smoke goes when the cold is serious. Go look at it before you leave. It is worth seeing. Not because it is remarkable to look at, because it is not. Because a woman spent 2 years building something that the world could barely see, in a place where the world was not paying attention, for reasons that the world was not prepared to understand, and the world was wrong, and she was right. And the proof of it is that on the coldest mornings in Dakota Territory, that hill still holds its warmth. As hills do, as well-made things do, long after the hands that made them are still. That is the whole account. That is what I know about Ingrid Solberg. Take care on the road east. The temperature drops fast this time of year once the sun goes. She would have noticed that already.